The rhythmic shriek of the paper shredder was the only sound in the boardroom, echoing like a mechanical executioner. I watched, paralyzed, as 3 years of my soul, my blueprints for the city's future, turned into thin, white ribbons of trash. Rowan and Thalia didn't just steal my career, they laughed while they did it. Their mockery cut deeper than the professional betrayal, their hysterical fingers pointing at my tears as if my dreams were the punchline to a cruel corporate joke. "You're a dreamer, Kiana," Rowan sneered, his voice dripping with the disdain of a man who had never built anything he didn't first steal. "And in this city, dreamers starve." An hour later, I stood in the rain-slicked parking lot, clutching the shredded remains of my life. I was blacklisted, broken, and alone. But then, a shadow fell over me, a presence so cold it made the winter rain feel warm. Ryu Seon-mok, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the underworld, didn't look at my tears. He looked at the blueprints I still held in my trembling hands. "They think you're nothing," he said, his eyes glowing with a lethal orange fire. "Let's show them what nothing can build." That night, I made a promise. They laughed at my dreams today, but soon, they would beg for my mercy. They tried to bury these secrets, but I dig them up every week. I am at Rose Noir Tales, and if you're tired of the same old stories, you're in the right place. Subscribe now so you're never left in the dark. Now, here is the real truth behind the rise of Kiana. The rain didn't stop, but the world around me seemed to go quiet as Ryu Seon-mok stepped closer. He was a pillar of shadow in the neon-blurred night, his dark pinstripe suit perfectly pressed despite the storm. Up close, the orange glow in his eyes wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a simmering heat, a fire that suggested he knew exactly what it felt like to be pushed to the edge. "Architecture is more than just glass and steel, Kiana," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. "It is the art of claiming space. It is about who has the right to stand and who is forced to kneel." He looked at the wet, shredded paper in my hands, the remains of my soul that Rowan and Thalia had laughed at only an hour ago. To them, it was trash. To this man, it was a weapon waiting to be forged. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a fountain pen. It was heavy, crafted from obsidian and capped with a gold nib that looked as sharp as a needle. He didn't offer me a handkerchief for my tears or a warm coat for the cold. He held out the pen. "This pen writes in 2 colors, he whispered, leaning in so only I could hear. "It writes in the gold of the empire you will build, and the blood of those who thought they could destroy you. Take it, and your dreams will no longer be something they can laugh at. They will be something they fear." My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew who this man was. To take anything from Ryu Seon-mok was to enter a world where there was no turning back, a world of iron and shadows. I looked at the dark building behind us where my former bosses were likely still toasting to my failure. I could feel the sting of their pointing fingers and the echo of their hysterics. I reached out, my fingers trembling and blue from the cold, and gripped the obsidian pen. The moment my skin touched the metal, a strange warmth flooded through me, staving off the shivering. The silent, paralyzing fear that usually choked my throat began to melt into something harder and sharper. "I don't want to just build," I said, my voice finally steadying. "I want them to see what they lost." Ryu's lips curved into a cold, stoic smile. He placed a heavy, protective hand on my shoulder, his presence towering over me like a fortress. "Then follow me, Kiana. Tonight, we stop dreaming. Tonight, we start constructing your revenge." He turned toward a waiting black sedan, and as I stepped into the car, leaving the shredded paper in the mud, I knew the timid girl who couldn't speak up was gone. In her place, a ghost was rising. The black sedan glided through the rain-drenched streets until we reached an unmarked industrial complex on the outskirts of the city. Ryu Seon-mok led me deep underground, past heavy steel doors that hissed open at his command. This was the Shadow Studio, a sleek, high-tech bunker filled with glowing monitors, advanced drafting tables, and a silence so profound it felt like a sanctuary. "This is your fortress," Ryu said, gesturing to a massive digital workspace. Here, Rowan and Thalia cannot reach you. Here, your voice is the only one that matters. I walked toward the central table, my fingers still tracing the smooth obsidian pen he had given me. For years, I had worked in a glass office where every idea I had was picked apart by predators. Now, I was surrounded by concrete and iron, protected by a man who treated my vision like sacred ground. I began to draw. The silent, paralyzing fear that used to keep me quiet during meetings was gone, replaced by a relentless, burning focus. My hand moved with a confidence I had never felt before. I wasn't just designing a building, I was designing the Kagis Tower, a structure of glass and steel so revolutionary it would make everything my former bosses ever built look like ancient ruins. As the days turned into weeks, the bunker became my entire world. I lived on coffee and determination, fueled by the memory of Rowan's mocking laughter and Thalia's crinkled eyes of malice. Every line I sketched was a strike against them. Every floor I planned was a step toward their professional grave. I worked in the dim light of the studio, pouring my anger into the blueprints, creating a masterpiece that the world would never be able to ignore. Ryu often stood in the shadows, watching me work. He didn't ask for progress reports or set deadlines. He simply provided the untraceable resources I needed, his presence a constant reminder of the power now backing my dreams. I was no longer a timid employee begging for a seat at the table. I was an architect of vengeance, building an empire from the dark. The Kagis Tower was growing on the screen, a shimmering vision of the future. It was beautiful, cold, and lethal, just like the man who had saved me. I realized then that my revenge wouldn't come from a shouted argument or a public scene. It would come from the skyline itself. When this tower rose, Rowan and Thalia would finally understand that the girl they had laughed at was the only person capable of truly changing the world. While I worked in the silence of the underground bunker, the world outside began to crumble for Rowan and Thalia. Revenge, I learned from Ryu Seon-mok, was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, steady leak that drained an enemy until they were hollow. Using the untraceable resources Ryu provided, we began a silent assault on the firm that had discarded me. It started with a whisper in the financial markets, a tiny crack in their pristine corporate image that soon grew into a canyon. I watched from my monitors as the stock prices of the old firm began to plummet. It was a mysterious, downward slide that no analyst could explain. One day their valuation was at an all-time high. The next, investors were fleeing in a blind panic. I felt a cold thrill as I saw the red lines on the charts diving deeper and deeper. This was the blood and gold Ryu had promised. Every dollar they lost was a brick in the foundation of my new empire. Rowan and Thalia had no idea that the girl they had mocked was the one pulling the strings from the shadows. I knew their firm's internal weaknesses better than anyone, and I guided Ryu's financial team to strike at their most vulnerable points. We didn't just target their money, we targeted their reputation. Major clients began to pull out of long-standing contracts, citing unforeseen concerns about the firm's leadership. The very people who had once bowed to Rowan and Thalia were now turning their backs on them. I spent my nights refining the Kagis Tower, but my days were occupied with watching the chaos I had created. I saw news clips of Rowan leaving the office with a frantic expression, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and his confidence shaken. Thalia was no longer laughing. Her face was a mask of stress as she tried to handle the PR nightmare. They were drowning in a sea of red ink, and there was no one to pull them out. Ryu stood behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder as the latest market closing showed another 10% drop in their value. They are beginning to realize that the ground they stand on is not as solid as they thought, he said, his eyes glowing with that familiar, lethal fire. I nodded, my heart steady and cold. The humiliation they had forced upon me was being returned to them, cent by cent. I wasn't just building a tower anymore. I was building a cage for the people who had tried to break me. The grand ballroom was a sea of sparkling crystal and forced smiles, a desperate attempt by the firm to show the world they were still winning. Rowan and Thalia stood at the center of it all, raising glasses of expensive champagne to celebrate their latest victory, a massive city contract they believed would save them from the plummeting stock prices. I watched them through a hidden camera feed back in the shadow studio, my heart as cold as the marble floors of the gala. They were dressed in their finest suits, laughing just as loudly as they had the night they shredded my work, oblivious to the fact that the floor was about to vanish beneath their feet. A toast to the future, Rowan shouted, his voice echoing with a hollow confidence. He draped an arm over Thalia's shoulder, and for a moment, they looked exactly like the untouchable predators they used to be. They thought they had outmaneuvered the market. They thought the dream plot was finally theirs to build upon. They had no idea that the contract they were celebrating had already been terminated an hour ago by a silent, anonymous board of directors. Even worse, they didn't know that the very company now holding the rights to that land was Aderna Holdings, my company. Beside me, Ryu Seon-mok watched the screen with a stoic expression, his eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the party. They are celebrating a ghost, he whispered. They think they have found a life raft, but they have only tied themselves to a sinking stone. He was right. Every handshake they made and every smile they gave was a lie. They were spending money they no longer had, promising results they could no longer deliver. The trader's banquet was in full swing, but the feast was already over. I felt a strange sense of calm as I watched Thalia mock a younger assistant, her crinkled eyes full of the same malice she had directed at me. She didn't realize that in less than 24 hours, her keycard wouldn't work, her accounts would be frozen, and her name would be a warning to the rest of the industry. The contract they thought they had won was the final bait in the trap I had built. As the music peaked and the applause filled the room, I turned away from the screen. I didn't need to see the end of the party to know how it felt. I picked up the obsidian fountain pen and drew a single, sharp line through their names on my digital desk. The banquet was their last meal as masters of the city. Tomorrow, they would wake up to the reality that the dreamer they had laughed at now owned the very air they breathed. The morning after the banquet, the air in the shadow studio felt different. Sharper, more focused. Ryu Seon-mok stood by the large glass drafting table, his shadow stretching long across my latest designs for the Keigi's tower. He didn't look like a businessman or a mentor at that moment. He looked like a general inspecting a battlefield. He beckoned me over, his eyes glowing with that intense orange fire that signaled a lesson was coming. "You have the talent to build, Kiana," he said, his voice as steady as stone. "But to survive men like Rowan and Thalia, you must learn how to strike." He pointed to a specific section of my blueprint, a complex structural support system that I had designed for beauty and efficiency. "This is not just a support beam. In the world of power, this is a pressure point. If you control the structural integrity of a city's growth, you control the city itself." He took the obsidian pen from my hand and drew a circle around a small, seemingly insignificant detail in the zoning plans. "A blueprint is a weapon if held correctly," he whispered. "Your enemies think they are fighting a war of money, but you are fighting a war of foundations. When you design a building that everyone needs but only you can complete, you hold their lives in your hands." I watched as he explained how to use my designs to corner the market on essential materials and labor. It wasn't about being cruel, it was about being undeniable. He was teaching me the iron hand, the ability to be firm and immovable in a world that tries to push you down. The timid girl who used to apologize for her ideas was being replaced by someone who understood that her vision was a force of nature. "Rowan and Thalia used their words to hurt you," Ryu continued, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder. "But words are air. Steel is reality. When they look up at your tower, they won't hear your voice, but they will feel your power. Every floor you add is a weight on their chests." I felt a surge of cold confidence. The fear that had once paralyzed me was gone, replaced by a strategic clarity. I looked at the obsidian pen, then back at my work. I wasn't just drawing a dream anymore, I was carving out a territory. Ryu had shown me that my mind was the most dangerous weapon in the room. As I returned to the table, my hand didn't tremble. I began to refine the Keigi's tower with a new purpose. It was time to stop being the victim and start being the architect of their downfall. The day of the silent auction felt like a cold, sharp blade. Rowan and Thalia arrived early at the auction house, dressed in their finest suits, their faces glowing with a desperate, false confidence. They believed the dream plot, the last piece of prime land in the city center, was their final chance at salvation. They had scraped together every remaining cent of the firm's dwindling capital, certain that no one else had the liquid cash to compete. I watched them from a private balcony, hidden behind tinted glass, my hand resting on the obsidian pen in my pocket. The room was quiet as the auctioneer began. Rowan leaned forward, a hungry look in his eyes as he placed their bid. It was a massive number, more than they could truly afford, but he smiled at Thalia as if the victory was already theirs. He didn't know that Ryu Seon-mok had spent the last week setting up Aderna Holdings, a ghost company backed by a web of untraceable offshore accounts. To the world, Aderna was a mystery. To me, it was the hammer I was about to drop. When the auctioneer called for final offers, Ryu gave me a slight nod. His orange eyes were fixed on my former bosses with a lethal focus. I signaled our representative on the floor. The new bid went up, outperforming Rowan's offer by exactly $1 million. The color drained from Rowan's face instantly. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with panic, trying to find the rival who was crushing his last hope. Thalia gripped the edge of the table, her hysterical laughter from weeks ago now replaced by a silent, open-mouthed shock. They tried to counterbid, but their financial advisor whispered a frantic no in Rowan's ear. They were at their limit. They were empty. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell with a thunderous crack. The dream plot belonged to Aderna Holdings. It belonged to me. I watched from above as Rowan slumped into his chair, looking like a man who had just seen his own ghost. Thalia began to argue with the staff, her voice shrill and desperate, but it was over. The land where I would build the Kagi's tower was officially mine. Ryu stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the balcony. The foundation is laid, Kiana, he said softly. Now, we don't just build a skyscraper. We build their tomb. I looked down at the obsidian pen. The girl who had cried in the rain was gone. As I walked out of the auction house, I didn't feel pity for the two broken people on the floor below. I only felt the weight of the iron in my hand and the thrill of the blood and gold finally coming home. The morning air was crisp as I stood before the towering glass facade of the firm that had once been my prison. I wasn't wearing the modest, timid attire of an assistant anymore. I was dressed in a sharp, charcoal suit that commanded respect. Beside me, Ryu Seon-mok stood like a silent sentinel, his presence casting a long, intimidating shadow across the lobby floor. We didn't wait for an invitation. I walked through the security gates with a calm authority that made the guards freeze. As we stepped into the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished steel. The silent, paralyzing fear was nowhere to be found. When the doors opened on the executive floor, the office was in a state of frantic chaos. Employees were packing boxes, and the sound of panicked phone calls filled the air. Rowan and Thalia were in the center of the room, shouting at a group of lawyers. They looked haggard, their expensive suits wrinkled and their eyes bloodshot from a night of losing everything. When Rowan saw me, he stopped mid-sentence. A sneer started to form on his face, the old instinct to mock me still buried deep in his bones. Kiana? What are you doing here? He barked, his voice cracking. We're in the middle of a crisis. We don't have time for disgruntled ex-employees. Thalia joined him, her eyes crinkling with that familiar malice. Did you come to beg for your old desk back? Because we're about to clear it out anyway. I didn't flinch. I didn't even speak at first. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out the legal folder Mr. Albright had prepared, tossing it onto the large mahogany table between us. I'm not here for a job, Rowan, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm here as the representative of Aderna Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute. Rowan's hand trembled as he opened the folder. His face turned a ghostly shade of white as he read the first page. Thalia leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. They weren't just looking at the auction results for the dream plot. They were looking at the deed to the very building they were standing in. You bought the skyscraper? Thalia whispered, her voice trembling. I am your new landlord, I replied, leaning forward until I could see the reflection of my triumph in their terrified eyes. And your lease has just been terminated. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises. Ryu stepped forward, his orange eyes glowing with a lethal satisfaction. He didn't need to say a word, his sheer power felt like a physical weight in the room. I watched as the realization finally crashed down on them. The girl they had laughed at, the dreamer they had tried to destroy, now held their entire world in her hands. As they began to scramble, humiliated and broken in front of their entire staff, I realized that Ryu was right. Steel was reality. And today, reality was mine. After the high of the takeover, a strange quiet settled over the shadow studio. Ryu Seon-mok had disappeared for the evening, leaving behind a set of coordinates on a scrap of paper. Driven by a curiosity I couldn't explain, I drove to the edge of the city's oldest district, far from the gleaming towers we were now building. There, surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown weeds, stood the skeletal remains of a half-finished apartment complex. It was a haunting sight. The concrete was cracked, and iron rebar poked out of the walls like broken bones. I stepped inside the hollow lobby, the air cold and smelling of damp stone. This wasn't a corporate office, it was a grave for someone's ambition. As I walked deeper into the ruins, I found a small, dusty room that looked like it had once been an architect's office. On the floor lay a framed photograph, the glass shattered. I picked it up and wiped away the grime. The photo showed a much younger Ryu, standing proudly in front of this very building. Beside him was a woman with a gentle smile and a small child. They looked happy, full of the dreams Ryu now claimed were useless. I realized then that this was the first project Ryu had ever lost. It wasn't just a failed business deal, it was the place where his life had been dismantled. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned to see Ryu standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. The orange glow in his eyes was dimmer now, replaced by a hollow, ancient sadness. I built this for them, he said, his voice barely a whisper, echoing the way Leo's mother had written about her son's lost imagination. But the people who owned the land, the same families that backed Rowan and Thalia, decided my vision was a threat. They didn't just take the building, they took everything. I looked from the photo to the man who had become my iron-fisted mentor. I saw the lines on his face deepening, a testament to the weight of a shame he had carried for decades. He hadn't saved me out of pure kindness. He had saved me because I was the second chance he never got. He was projecting his own stolen history onto my success, using me to win a war that had already cost him his soul. My heart ached as I realized the bitter irony of our victory. Ryu had taught me to use a blueprint as a weapon because he had once been the victim of one. As we stood in the ruins of his past, I felt the cold anger inside me begin to thaw, replaced by a flicker of compassion. I wasn't just his student anymore. I was the witness to a pain that steel and gold could never fully repair. The cold reality of the industry finally caught up with Thalia. Just weeks after she had pointed and laughed at my distress, she stood at my new doorstep, her expensive coat stained by the rain and her eyes red from crying. The firm was gone, their bank accounts were frozen, and the name she had used to intimidate others was now a joke in every boardroom in the city. I watched her through the security monitor, remembering the silent, paralyzing fear her laughter used to cause me. When I opened the door, she didn't look like the predator I once feared. She looked small, defeated, and desperate. "Kiana, please," she sobbed, her voice trembling just as mine once had. "I've lost everything. The bank is taking my house, and no one will even take my calls. I know I was cruel, but I'm begging you for a second chance. I'll work for nothing. I'll be your assistant. Just don't let me drown." For a moment, the wall around my heart cracked. I saw the genuine anguish on her face, and I remembered the girl I used to be, the one who just wanted to build beautiful things. I almost reached out. I almost told her it was okay. But then, the image of Ryu's ruined apartment complex flashed in my mind. I remembered the shredder's whistle and the way she had mocked my very existence. I stepped back, my resolve hardening into the iron Ryu had taught me to wield. You didn't just steal my work, Thalia, I said quietly, my voice steady and cold. You tried to kill the part of me that believed in the world. You taught me that success is everything, and now you have to live with the lesson you gave me. She left in silence, her shoulders slumped as she walked back into the dark. I had won. I had humiliated her just as she had once humiliated me. But as I watched her walk away, I felt a strange twist in my stomach, a mix of satisfaction and an unexpected, hollow discomfort. I had the power now, but I realized that simply breaking her wasn't as fulfilling as I had imagined it would be. The morning light hit the glass of the completed Keigi's tower, turning the entire structure into a pillar of shimmering gold. I stood on the top floor, looking out over the skyline I had finally conquered. Below me, the city was moving, breathing, and growing, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a battlefield. Rowan and Thalia were gone, their names erased from the ledgers of the elite. They lived in the shadow of my success, forced to see my tower every single day and know they were wrong about me. I had achieved the blood and gold Ryu had promised. I had my revenge, and it was as exquisite as I had imagined. But as I looked at the obsidian pen on my desk, I realized that the house of cards I had built on anger was not enough. I thought about Ryu's ruined building and the photo of the man he used to be before the world made him iron. I realized that if I only focused on destruction, I would eventually become just as hollow as my enemies. I made one final call to Mr. Albright. I instructed him to take a portion of the profits from the Keigi's tower and fund a new initiative, the Visionary Foundation. It would be a school for young architects, dreamers like the girl I once was, who had the talent but lacked the protection to survive the corporate predators. I would give them the tools, the office, and the voice that had been stolen from me. When Ryu Seon-mok visited me that evening, he didn't scowl at my choice. He stood by the window, his orange eyes reflecting the sunset. You chose a different path, Kiana, he said, his voice less like a weapon and more like a weary man finding rest. You built a bridge where I only knew how to build walls. Success is a powerful revenge, I replied, looking him in the eye without fear. But building something that outlasts the hate, that is the real victory. I hit upload on my final video, sharing the journey from the girl crying in the rain to the woman who owned the sky. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't a monster. I was a builder. As the screen faded to black, my final words resonated with thousands who had been told they were useless. They laughed at my dreams, so I built an empire. And then, I built a future. As the sun sets over the Keigi's tower, the lesson is clear. Your value is never defined by the people who tried to break you. Rowan and Thalia thought they could destroy Kiana's dreams by shredding her work, but all they did was clear the path for her to build an empire. Revenge might have been the spark that started this fire, but peace and purpose were the only things that kept it burning. True success isn't just about outbidding your enemies or watching them fall. It's about growing so high that their voices can no longer reach you. But Kiana's journey is far from over. While her tower now defines the skyline, a new shadow is looming. Ryu Seon-mok's past is beginning to surface, and Kiana is about to discover that maintaining an empire requires a different kind of strength than building one. Part 2 is dropping soon, and you won't want to miss the moment Kiana is forced to choose between the man who saved her and the soul she fought so hard to keep. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to Rose Noir Tales to join our community of dreamers. Turn on the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next chapter arrives. Until then, remember that a foundation is often strongest after it's been tested by the storm. Keep building, and thank you for watching.